Science, science, science.
Invasive plants. Generally, pretty bad for our native ecosystems, and so are importantly targets for management. But whether or not actually removing the invader leads to positive outcomes for native species is often unknown. Basically, where time and resources are limited, the standard approach is to take information on the invader's identity and some measure of its invasiveness, and use that to infer negative effects on native species, which triggers control actions that, when successful, are then used to infer positive effects on native species. The whole system is predicated on the accurate generalizations that 1. Invasive plants impact native plants, and 2. Removal of the invader removes that direct impact. But it also relies an awful lot on those inferred relationships always being strong and stable. Largely skips the let's evaluate and validate these inferences with our own monitoring step, and doesn't really acknowledge that context specificity in all this is hugely important. Take Bitou Bush for example. This shrub completely dominates and impacts native plant diversity in coastal scrubland communities, and the control of which is associated with some positive native plant recovery. Good, inferences hold. However, Bitou Bush doesn't have anywhere near the same serious impacts when invading coastal forest communities, with natives able to persist and overall plant diversity not being so strongly affected. And therefore, the control of Bitou is a disturbance that creates establishment opportunities for other plant invaders. Which brings me to our study, which looked at how native species were responding over a 10-year period in an invaded forest ecosystem where Bitou Bush was being actively managed. In brief, this is what we found. First, how effective was the ongoing control of Bitou Bush over the long term? So for a bit of background, the managers at the national park where we undertook this study were using a management regime sequence of herbicide spray, then a fire, and then another spray to control Bitou Bush. Spray, fire, spray. However, achieving that ideal sequence over multiple years has proven to be logistically difficult, and so almost all invaded and managed sites have their own unique and complex management histories of incomplete treatment, maybe a single fire and spray, and then sometime later Bitou Bush reinvades, and so it's sprayed but no fire, so it reinvades again, and so another spray, and so on and so on. After 10 years, we found that while Bitou Bush cover in this forest was much lower than when monitoring started, Bitou Bush still persisted at around 50% of sites despite ongoing management efforts. The long-term removal of Bitou Bush in our study wasn't associated with the use of fire at all, but rather it came down to the cumulative number of times a site was sprayed. Each subsequent spray would get you a little bit closer to knocking off that less than 20% cover that re-established, and actually removing Bitou Bush for good. But ultimately, we want to know that our management is having positive effects for native species, which brings us to our main question. What were the long-term impacts of Bitou Bush reinvading sites after management action? For this, we looked beyond simply the effects of this invasive plant on native plants, and also looked at what native birds, reptiles, and small mammals were doing in response to these changes. We summarised our data for each of our different groups into the classic biodiversity indicators that are widely used to inform management decisions. And we found, as expected, that the cover of native plants was very strongly negatively associated with increased cover of Bitou Bush. Bitou Bush reinvades, and native plants are impacted. Makes sense. But not so readily expected, we found that the abundance of native birds and small mammals was weakly positively associated with increased cover of Bitou Bush. Bitou reinvades, and some native fauna benefit. Interesting. So if we rewind back to the start and ask ourselves just how generalizable those inferences that are so consistently made actually are, can the response of the invader to management be used to infer the biodiversity outcomes of management? Yeah, sure thing. The abundance of native plants, birds and small mammals were all associated with and able to be predicted from what the invader did following management. But the magnitudes and directions of those associations were not all the same. Some strong and negative, others weaken positive. Importantly, the conclusion you draw in regards to what your management means for biodiversity will be dependent on the indicators you use and the weight you give them. If we just looked at plants, successful management increases native plant cover. Therefore, we'd conclude management has a positive effect for biodiversity. If we just looked at birds, successful management decreases bird abundance, but only a little, and native birds are really abundant in this forest generally, so therefore we'd probably conclude management has mostly a neutral effect on biodiversity. But if we just looked at small mammals, successful management decreases small mammal abundance a little, but small mammals are in decline in this forest overall, so therefore we might conclude that management actually has some negative effect on biodiversity. Each conclusion is accurate, but doesn't capture the whole story. So the take-home message is, contextual evaluation of even the most established generalizations in invasive plant management is critically important. We completed this work in collaboration with the Wreck Bay Aboriginal community and the natural resource managers of Buderi National Park in southeastern Australia. This video represents just a skim of what is described and discussed in the paper we published in Scientific Reports. A link to that paper and all other supporting references mentioned in this video are linked in the description. You can find out more about this and any of my other research from my website or by following me on Twitter. Thanks for watching, cheers.